The land remembers. Before the maps were drawn, before fences cut the horizon into squares, before the word Australia was spoken in any European tongue, the land already had a memory. In the north of the continent, in what is now called Arnhem Land, the red earth stretched beneath a sky so vast it seemed eternal. Mangroves traced the coastline. Eucalyptus forests whispered in dry winds. Rivers carved slow paths through sandstone and scrub. And for more than 60,000 years, the Yolnu people belonged to this place, not as owners, but as kin. Country was not property. Country was ancestor. Every hill carried a name older than memory. Every waterhole held a story of creation. These stories were not myths in the modern sense. They were law, binding, living, and precise. They told who could fish in certain waters, who could marry who must sing which song at which ceremony. They mapped the stars and the tides. They recorded trade routes stretching across the continent. Long before 1788, the Yolnu traders exchanged sea cucumbers and ochre with visitors from what is now Indonesia. The world knew this land, even if Europe claimed not to. Then in 1788, ships appeared at the edge of another shoreline, far south, in what would become Sydney. Under the command of Captain Arthur Phillip, Britain declared possession of the continent. The legal doctrine used was Terra nullius, land belonging to no one. It was a phrase that would echo for nearly 2 centuries. For the Yolnu, life continued largely undisturbed for generations. Arnhem Land remained remote, difficult to access, shielded by geography. Missions came in the early 20th century, bringing Christianity, schooling, and foreign systems of authority. But even then, Yolnu law endured beneath the surface. Ceremonies were still held, songlines were still sung, the land still remembered. By the mid-20th century, Australia was changing rapidly. The nation had fought in 2 world wars. Cities were growing, industry expanded. The government looked north and saw not sacred ground, but resources. In the early 1960s, geological surveys revealed vast deposits of bauxite on the Gove Peninsula. Bauxite meant aluminum. Aluminum meant progress, planes, buildings, modernity. The Commonwealth granted mining leases without consulting the traditional owners. There were no negotiations, no treaty had ever been signed, no agreement had ever ceded the land. Bulldozers began to arrive. For the Yolnu clans of Yirrkala, the threat was not abstract. Sacred sites lay within the proposed mining zone. Burial grounds, ceremonial grounds, places tied to ancestral beings whose stories stretched back beyond human reckoning. The elders gathered beneath the shade of stringbark trees. They debated not whether to resist, but how. They understood something crucial. Violence would bring destruction, but silence would bring erasure. So they chose a path no one expected. Instead of spears, they prepared bark. The Petition on Bark. In 1963, in the small community of Yirrkala, sheets of stringbark were carefully cut, flattened, and prepared. On their surface, clan designs were painted in ochre, intricate patterns representing ancestral law. But this time, something new was added: typed text in English. The document would become known as the Yirrkala Bark Petitions, the first traditional Aboriginal documents ever formally presented to the Australian Parliament. The petition stated clearly that the Yolnu people were the traditional owners of the land. It declared that their rights had been ignored. It asked the Parliament to recognize their law
and prevent the destruction of sacred sites. This was not rebellion, it was diplomacy, conducted in two legal languages at once. When the petitions reached Canberra, they caused quiet shock. For many politicians, it was the first time they had seen Indigenous law expressed not as anthropology, but as political claim. A parliamentary committee was formed, hearings were conducted, Yolnu leaders traveled vast distances to give evidence. But the mining project continued. In 1968, the Yolnu took the matter to court in what became the Yirrkala case, officially Yirrkala v. Nabalco Pty Ltd. For the first time in Australian history, Aboriginal plaintiffs argued that their traditional land ownership predated British sovereignty. Anthropologists testified to the complexity of Yolnu society. Evidence showed detailed kinship systems, trade networks, ceremonial law, a structured civilization. In 1971, Justice Blackburn delivered his judgment. He acknowledged that the Yolnu had a sophisticated legal system, but he ruled that Australian law did not recognize native title. Terra nullius remained intact. The case was lost. Yet across Australia, something had shifted. The public had followed the story. Newspapers carried images of bark petitions and Yolnu elders standing in court. 6 years earlier, in 1967, Australians had voted overwhelmingly in the 1967 Australian referendum to amend the Constitution regarding Aboriginal people. Over 90% voted yes. It was one of the strongest mandates in the nation's history. Though the referendum did not grant land rights, it revealed a changing conscience. The Yolnu loss in court did not end the movement, it strengthened it. In 1976, the federal government passed the Aboriginal Land Rights Act 1976, allowing Indigenous people in the Northern Territory to claim land based on traditional ownership. The seeds planted in Yirrkala had begun to grow. Then, in 1992, nearly 30 years after the bark petitions were sent, the High Court handed down its decision in Mabo v. Queensland No. 2. Led by Koiki Mabo, the case overturned terra nullius. Native title was recognized. The legal fiction that the land had belonged to no one was finally dismantled. Today, the original bark petitions hang in Parliament House, not as artifacts, as reminders. They remind Australia that long before British law, there was law here, that sovereignty was never formally ceded, that the land remembers its first custodians. And in Arnhem Land, ceremonies continue. Songlines are still sung. The red earth still holds memory. The story did not begin in 1963, and it does not end in 1992, because history, like country, is alive.
Fire at Wave Hill. In August 1966, far from the humid coastline of Arnhem Land, another chapter in Australia's Indigenous struggle was unfolding beneath a different sky. At Wave Hill Station in the Northern Territory, a vast cattle property owned by the British pastoral company Vesties, Aboriginal stockmen walked off the job. They had labored for generations under brutal conditions, paid in rations instead of wages, housed in tin shacks, controlled by managers who held power over every movement of their lives. The walk-off was led by a quiet, determined Gurindji man named Vincent Lingiari. At first, the protest was framed as an industrial dispute. Equal wages had been promised, but not delivered. Yet, as weeks turned into months, the strike revealed something deeper. This was not only about pay, it was about land. The Gurindji people had lived on that country long before it became a cattle station.
Sacred sites lay within its boundaries. Songlines crossed its plains. The land was tied to their ancestors. After the walk-off, the Gurindji established a camp at Wadi Creek, Daguragu. They refused to return to Wave Hill under the old system. The protest lasted not weeks, not months, but years. Across Australia, the story spread. University students, trade unions, church groups, and activists rallied in support. The Indigenous land rights movement gained a powerful symbol: Aboriginal workers standing not in submission, but in assertion. In 1975, nearly a decade after the strike began, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam traveled to Dagurabu. Before cameras and gathered supporters, Whitlam poured a handful of red soil into Vincent Lingiari's palm. The gesture was symbolic, but powerful. It represented the Australian government formally returning a portion of land to the Gurindji people. For many Australians watching, it was the first time they saw an Aboriginal leader treated not as a subject of policy, but as a partner in justice. The Uluru Bark Petitions had been a legal argument. The Gurindji walk-off was a moral one. Together, they were reshaping the national conscience. A decision written in law. While protests stirred the outback and public opinion shifted in the cities, one man in the Torres Strait was quietly preparing a challenge that would reach the highest court in the nation. Koiki Mabo was born on Mare, known to outsiders as Murray Island in the Torres Strait. From childhood, he learned the boundaries of his family's land, where gardens were planted, where fishing rights lay, which areas belonged to which clans. In 1982, Mabo and fellow plaintiffs began legal action against the state of Queensland, arguing that their traditional ownership of Mare had never been extinguished. The case would take 10 years. It would outlive Mabo himself. He died in January 1992, months before judgment was delivered. On June 3, 1992, the High Court of Australia announced its decision in Mabo v. Queensland No. 2. By a majority of 6-1, the court rejected the doctrine of Terra nullius. For the first time, Australian law recognized that Indigenous people held rights to land before British colonization, and that those rights could continue as native title. The ruling did not rewrite history, but it corrected a legal fiction. In the judgment, the court acknowledged that the land was not empty in 1788. It was inhabited by organized societies with laws and customs. The words were simple. The impact was immense. Across the country, celebrations and anxieties unfolded side by side. Some feared uncertainty over land ownership. Others saw long-delayed justice. For many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, it was vindication. The Uluru elders who sent bark petitions in 1963 did not live to see Terra nullius fall. Yet their courage had forced Australia to begin confronting its foundations. The Gurindji stand at Wave Hill had demonstrated that land was not merely economic property, it was identity. And Mabo had transformed moral argument into constitutional law. A nation still listening. Today, in Parliament House in Canberra, the Yirrkala Bark Petitions remain preserved. They are not relics of protest, they are constitutional milestones. In Arnhem Land, ceremonies continue as they have for millennia. Children learn kinship systems, elders teach language, rangers manage country using knowledge passed down through countless generations. Australia's story is no longer told as if it began in 1788. It is told as a much older narrative, one that stretches back beyond pyramids, beyond Rome, beyond recorded European time. The struggle for recognition is not finished. Conversations about treaty, constitutional reform, and reconciliation continue in modern Australia. But one truth stands in law. The land was never empty. It was and remains country. And country remembers.
The Apology. On the morning of 13 February 2008, thousands gathered outside Parliament House in Canberra. Some stood wrapped in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags. Others held photographs, black and white faces of children taken decades earlier. Many of those children had never come home. Inside the chamber, silence settled as Prime Minister Kevin Rudd rose to speak. For much of the 20th century, Australian governments had removed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families under policies of assimilation. These children, now known as the stolen generations, were placed in missions, foster homes, or institutions. Many were forbidden from speaking their language. Many never saw their parents again. The policy had been justified at the time as protection. In reality, it fractured families, erased identity, and left wounds that would echo across generations. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report documented the scale and trauma of forced removals. It recommended a formal national apology. For more than a decade, that apology did not come. Until 2008. Rudd's words were direct. "We apologize for the laws and policies of successive parliaments and governments that have inflicted profound grief, suffering, and loss. We say sorry." The word hung in the air. Sorry. For some, it was long overdue. For others, it was uncomfortable. Yet across the lawns outside Parliament, tears flowed freely. Elders held one another. Survivors of removal closed their eyes as if finally allowed to exhale. The apology did not change property rights. It did not erase disadvantage. It did not undo trauma. But it marked something essential: the nation acknowledging its own history. In Arnhem Land, in the Torres Strait, in remote desert communities and city suburbs alike, many Indigenous Australians watched the broadcast with cautious hope. They had heard promises before. Still, the land remembers when words shift. The question of voice. In 2017, more than 250 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander delegates gathered at Uluru after a series of regional dialogues across the country. They produced a single-page document, the Uluru Statement from the Heart. It called for three things: voice, treaty, truth. At its center was a proposal for a constitutionally enshrined Indigenous voice to Parliament, an advisory body that would allow First Nations peoples to speak directly on laws affecting them. The statement was poetic yet precise. It spoke of the torment of our powerlessness and invited the Australian people to walk together in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. For years, the proposal moved through political debate. Supporters argued it was a modest reform, recognition combined with practical input. Critics questioned constitutional change. Public opinion shifted, hardened, softened again. In 2023, Australians voted in a referendum on whether to alter the Constitution to establish the voice. The result was no. For many Indigenous Australians, it felt like a familiar ache. The sense of progress halted,
of invitation declined. Yet others pointed to history. The Bark Petitions were rejected. The Yolnu had lost in court. The Gurindji had waited 9 years for land to be returned. Mabo took a decade and cost its leader his lifetime. Change in Australia has rarely been swift. It has come through persistence. Across the country, Indigenous rangers manage vast tracts of land using traditional ecological knowledge combined with modern science. Cultural burning practices are being recognized for their role in preventing catastrophic bushfires. Languages once on the brink of extinction are being revitalized in schools and communities. The story is not of simple victory or defeat. It is one of endurance. The land and the future. In Arnhem Land today, children still learn the old songs. They paint on bark. They sit beside elders who trace clan designs in ochre and explain what each line means. Country is not a symbol. It is living law. Australia as a nation-state is just over 2 centuries old. Australian Aboriginal cultures stretch back more than 60 millennia. When Australians debate identity, constitution, or reconciliation, they are not debating abstract politics. They are negotiating how a modern nation sits upon ancient ground. The land remembers the first footsteps. It remembers the sails on the horizon. It remembers the bark petitions, the red soil poured into Vincent Lingiari's hand, the High Court's ruling, the word sorry spoken in Parliament, the referendum ballots cast across the country. History here is layered, not linear. And beneath it all, songlines still cross the continent, invisible yet unbroken. Closing reflection. If you began this journey wondering when Australia's story truly starts, the answer is this. It does not begin in 1788. It begins in deep time, in ceremony, in law, in country. And it continues now in the choices Australians make about recognition, justice, and shared future. Because the land is still here, and it is still listening.
Truth on the frontier. For generations, much of Australia's frontier history was told in a single voice. It was a story of explorers, settlers, and pioneers carving opportunity from wilderness. School textbooks spoke of hardship, courage, expansion. They rarely spoke of resistance. They rarely spoke of massacre. Yet across the continent, from Tasmania to Queensland, from the Kimberley to New South Wales, conflict accompanied colonization. Aboriginal nations defended their land. Settler forces, sometimes assisted by native police units, retaliated with lethal force. In recent decades, historians have documented frontier violence with increasing detail. Sites once unmarked are now recognized. Oral histories once dismissed are now recorded and respected. In Tasmania, the near destruction of Aboriginal communities during the 19th century stands as one of the starkest examples of colonial brutality. In Queensland, mounted native police patrols enforced expansion with devastating consequences. For much of the 20th century, these truths were marginalized. But truth, like country, waits. Across Australia, memorials are slowly appearing. Universities teach frontier history with greater nuance. Communities hold commemorations for ancestors who resisted invasion. Acknowledging frontier conflict does not erase national pride. It complicates it. And perhaps maturity requires complication. The Yolnu elders who painted the Bark Petitions were not only defending land from mining companies, they were challenging a national narrative that had long overlooked Indigenous sovereignty. Truth-telling has become an essential part of reconciliation discussions, not to assign inherited guilt, but to recognize inherited reality, because only a nation that understands its past can choose its future. Fire and knowledge. In the summer of 2019-20, Australia burned. Bushfires tore through New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia in what became known as the Black Summer. Homes were lost, wildlife perished in staggering numbers, smoke blanketed cities. As the nation searched for answers, attention turned to an ancient practice: cultural burning. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal communities had used controlled, low-intensity fire to manage landscapes. These burns reduced fuel loads, encouraged biodiversity, and maintained ecological balance. Colonial authorities had often suppressed these practices, viewing them as primitive or destructive. Yet modern fire science increasingly recognized what Indigenous custodians had always known: fire, when applied with knowledge and respect, protects. Across northern Australia, Aboriginal ranger groups now collaborate with environmental agencies. Traditional ecological knowledge, once dismissed, is integrated into land management strategies. In Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, early dry season burns create mosaic patterns across the landscape, reducing the intensity of later fires. This is not nostalgia, it is practical survival. The land remembers how to heal itself when guided properly. And the oldest continuous cultures on Earth carry knowledge shaped by tens of thousands of years of observation. Australia's future may depend in part on listening to its oldest teachers.
Fire and knowledge. In the summer of 2019 to 2020, Australia burned. Bushfires tore through New South Wales, Victoria, and South Australia in what became known as the Black Summer. Homes were lost, wildlife perished in staggering numbers, smoke blanketed cities. As the nation searched for answers, attention turned to an ancient practice: cultural burning. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal communities had used controlled, low-intensity fire to manage landscapes. These burns reduced fuel loads, encouraged biodiversity, and maintained ecological balance. Colonial authorities had often suppressed these practices, viewing them as primitive or destructive. Yet modern fire science increasingly recognized what Indigenous custodians had always known: fire, when applied with knowledge and respect, protects. Across northern Australia, Aboriginal ranger groups now collaborate with environmental agencies. Traditional ecological knowledge, once dismissed, is integrated into land management strategies. In Arnhem Land and the Kimberley, early dry season burns create mosaic patterns across the landscape, reducing the intensity of later fires. This is not nostalgia, it is practical survival. The land remembers how to heal itself when guided properly. And the oldest continuous cultures on Earth carry knowledge shaped by tens of thousands of years of observation. Australia's future may depend, in part, on listening to its oldest teachers. Part 9. Language and Survival. Before colonization, more than 250 distinct Indigenous languages were spoken across the continent. Each language held unique understandings of landscape, kinship, and cosmology. Words described relationships between people and country that English struggles to translate.
By the late 20th century, many of those languages were endangered. Some had already fallen silent. Language loss is not merely linguistic, it is cultural erosion. Yet revival movements are growing. In communities across the Northern Territory, Western Australia, and Queensland, elders record vocabulary and grammar. Schools incorporate bilingual education programs. Young people learn to greet one another in ancestral tongues. When a language is spoken again after decades of suppression, it carries more than sound. It carries resilience. The same resilience that sustained the Gurindji at Wave Hill, the same resilience that carried the Yolnu into courtrooms, the same resilience that fueled the Mabo challenge. Survival in Indigenous Australia's history is not passive endurance, it is active continuity. Walking forward together. Australia today stands at a crossroads, familiar yet new. The referendum on the voice in 2023 did not succeed. The Uluru Statement from the heart remains an invitation unanswered at a constitutional level. But invitations do not expire. Across suburbs and remote communities, conversations continue, sometimes tense, sometimes hopeful. Reconciliation is not a single event. It is a process measured in generations. The Bark Petitions of 1963 were once radical. Today, they hang in Parliament House as foundational documents. The Wave Hill walk-off was once dismissed as industrial unrest. Today, it is taught as a turning point in land rights history. Mabo was once controversial. Today, native title is embedded in Australian law. History suggests something profound. Change in Australia is slow, but it accumulates. The continent is ancient beyond imagination. The nation built upon it is comparatively young. If there is a lesson carried through these parts, from Arnhem Land to Wave Hill, from Mer Island to Canberra, it is this: country endures, and those who belong to it endure with it. The question facing modern Australia is not whether Indigenous history is part of the national story. It is whether the national story is ready to fully include the first one. The land is still here, the songlines are still sung, and the future is still being written.
The long shadow of memory. History does not disappear. It lingers in landscapes. It echoes in family stories. It lives in silence as much as in speech. Across Australia, there are places where the ground feels heavier, riverbanks where conflict unfolded, plains where stockmen once walked off in quiet defiance, courtrooms where arguments about sovereignty reshaped the law. In the decades following the decision in Mabo v. Queensland No. 2, native title claims began moving through Australia's legal system. Communities gathered genealogies, oral histories, anthropological evidence. Elders gave testimony about boundaries passed down through generations. The process was often slow and emotionally draining. To prove connection to land in a Western court required translating living law into affidavits and maps. Songlines had to become coordinates. Ceremony had to become evidence. Some claims succeeded. Others failed. Many took years, sometimes decades, to resolve. Yet each case represented something profound, the Australian legal system acknowledging that prior ownership had existed and, in many cases, endured. But legal recognition did not always mean economic equality. In remote communities, challenges remained stark: limited health care access, overcrowded housing, unemployment, intergenerational trauma. The legacy of dispossession cannot be reversed by a single court ruling.
Still, resilience persisted. In Arnhem Land, Indigenous ranger programs expanded. Young Yolno men and women worked alongside elders to manage sea country, protect sacred sites, and monitor wildlife. They navigated between two worlds, ancestral law and government policy, with increasing confidence. In the Torres Strait, communities continued to assert their cultural autonomy. The name of Koiki Mabo became part of national vocabulary, not merely as a plaintiff in a case, but as a symbol of patient determination. Meanwhile, universities across Australia began offering Indigenous studies programs shaped by Indigenous scholars. Museums re-evaluated collections, returning ancestral remains and sacred objects to communities from which they had been taken. These acts did not rewrite the past, but they acknowledged it. Generations in conversation. In many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, 3 generations now sit at the same table. Grandparents who remember mission life, parents who witnessed the land rights era, children growing up with digital technology and global awareness. Each generation carries different memories of Australia. Some elders remember when they could not vote. Others recall when wages were withheld under Protection Acts. Younger voices speak of climate change, cultural pride, and global Indigenous solidarity. The continuity lies not in uniform experience, but in shared connection to country. Across remote communities, initiation ceremonies continue. Art centers produce works that hang in international galleries. Musicians blend traditional language with contemporary rhythms. Filmmakers tell stories once filtered through outsiders. Indigenous identity in modern Australia is not frozen in time. It evolves, as all living cultures do. The National Mirror. For non-Indigenous Australians, the journey has also shifted. School curricula increasingly include frontier conflict, the stolen generations, and land rights movements. Public commemorations now acknowledge traditional custodians at major events. National Sari Day and NAIDOC Week draw participation across communities. Symbols matter, but substance matters more. The question that lingers is how to build a shared future on foundations once fractured. Reconciliation is often described as a bridge, yet bridges require pillars on both sides. Trust must be built not only through speeches, but through policy, in education, health, housing, and representation. And always, beneath debate and disagreement, lies the deeper recognition: Australia is home to the world's oldest continuing cultures. That truth is no longer academically disputed, it is internationally respected. The challenge is not proof, it is partnership. The land still listening. In the northern reaches of Arnhem Land, the tide rises and falls as it has for millennia. Saltwater people tend to sea country. Freshwater clans move inland with seasonal rhythms. The land has witnessed colonial arrival, mining booms, court battles, apologies, referendums. It remains. Perhaps that is the most grounding perspective of all. Political cycles pass quickly, measured in years. Cultural survival is measured in generations. Country is measured in deep time. The Bark Petitions of 1963 were once radical documents written in ochre and typewriter ink. Today, they are preserved as national treasures. The walk-off at Wave Hill was once dismissed as disobedience. Today, it is taught as a milestone of justice. The Mabo decision was once controversial. Today, native title is embedded in legal reality. History's verdict often changes with time. Looking forward. Part 11 does not end with triumph or tragedy. It ends with responsibility.
Australia's story continues to unfold, shaped by voters, lawmakers, elders, activists, teachers, and children yet to be born. The question is no longer whether Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history belongs within the national narrative. It is how deeply the nation is willing to listen to it. Because the songlines are not relics, they are pathways, and they are still being walked.
The oldest story, the newest nation. At dawn in northern Australia, the sky does not brighten all at once. First, there is a faint silver line at the horizon. Then the magenta deepens. Then the land slowly reveals itself, ridges, trees, water, stone. Australia's story has unfolded much the same way. For generations, only part of the landscape was visible in the national imagination. The rest lay in shadow, not absent, but unseen. Now, slowly, more of the picture emerges. The question of treaty. Unlike nations such as New Zealand, Canada, or the United States, Australia never signed a treaty with its First Peoples. There was no formal agreement, no negotiated surrender, no shared document marking coexistence. Sovereignty was assumed. In recent years, conversations about treaty have grown louder. In Victoria, formal treaty processes have begun at the state level. Other states explore frameworks for negotiation. Treaty is not a single document. It is a recognition that two legal and cultural systems have existed on this continent since 1788, one ancient, one imported. Some Australians view treaty as divisive, others see it as unfinished business. For many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders, it represents something simple yet profound. A seat at the table, not as subjects of policy, but as partners in nationhood. Identity in a shared land. Modern Australia is one of the most multicultural nations in the world. Millions have arrived from Europe, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and the Pacific. They have built lives, communities, industries. Their stories, too, are Australian. Yet beneath the diversity lies a singular truth. All Australians live on land that carries ancient custodianship. Acknowledgement of country, now common at public events, is more than ritual. It reflects a shift in national consciousness, an understanding that history did not begin with colonization. But acknowledgement alone is not enough. Listening is deeper than speaking. The strength of survival. Across the continent, Indigenous communities continue to shape their own futures. Art centers in remote regions produce works exhibited globally. Musicians sing in language on international stages. Rangers manage millions of hectares of land and sea country. Lawyers, doctors, teachers, and scholars emerge from communities once denied basic education. The narrative of Indigenous Australia is not solely one of suffering. It is one of endurance, adaptation, brilliance. It is one of the world's oldest continuous cultures navigating the pressures of the modern world and refusing to disappear. In classrooms, children now learn about the frontier wars alongside the gold rush. They study the 1967 referendum, the Wave Hill walk-off, the decision in Mabo versus Queensland No. 2, and the 2008 apology. They grow up with a fuller story, and a fuller story shapes a fuller identity. The invitation that remains. The Uluru Statement from the Heart described itself as an invitation. Invitations can be declined. They can also be revisited. Nations, like people, evolve. What feels impossible in one decade may become inevitable in another. The Bark Petitions were once radical. Land rights were once unthinkable. Native title was once legally invisible. History moves, slowly but unmistakably. The land at dusk.
As the sun sets over Arnhem Land, the earth glows red beneath fading light. The same light once touched the sails of the First Fleet. The same light shone on Gurindji stockmen walking off Wave Hill. The same light fell across the High Court steps in 1992. Country has witnessed every chapter. It will witness the next. The question facing Australia is not whether the oldest story belongs within the newest nation. It is whether the newest nation is ready to walk alongside the oldest story, not ahead of it, not behind it, but beside it. Final words. Australia is often described as a young country. In truth, it is both young and ancient at once. Young in its political structures, ancient in its cultural roots. The land remembers songlines traced across desert and coast. It remembers ceremony and trade long before European charts. It remembers conflict and resilience, silence and apology, rejection and recognition. And through it all, the first custodians remain, not relics of the past, not symbols for debate, but living peoples shaping tomorrow. The story does not end here. It continues in classrooms, courtrooms, parliaments, art studios, ranger stations, and family gatherings across the continent. It continues every time a child learns language once suppressed, every time country is cared for with ancient knowledge, every time Australians choose understanding over denial. Because this land was never empty. It was sung into being, and the song is still being sung.